The remark was made at the Ashmore Hunt breakfast. Not quietly. Not in the specific low register of a man saying something he half intends to keep private. In the open conversational tone of someone stating a fact about the weather or the quality of the morning's riding, a thing so obviously true that announcing it required no particular courage. Lord Cavendish had asked, over the kedgeree and the third round of coffee, about the new arrival at Hartwell. The woman from Somerset. The one who had been installed in the East Wing at the beginning of October with 2 trunks and no explanation beyond the general category of estate business. The Duke of Hartwell had set down his cup. "She'll be gone by winter," he said. "It's a temporary arrangement." Lord Cavendish had nodded. Sir Thomas Crane had moved on to the subject of the morning's prospects. And no one had said anything further because there was nothing further to say about a temporary arrangement in the East Wing that would resolve itself before the first frost. The woman in the East Wing did not hear this. She was, at the moment it was said, standing in the north field of the Hartwell estate in the specific cold of an early October morning, looking at a drainage problem that had been producing increasingly expensive consequences for the past 4 years and that had been described to her by the estate steward, Mr. Hodges, with the specific weary resignation of a man who has reported the same problem to the same quarterly meeting for long enough that he has stopped expecting the report to produce action. She was not from Somerset. She was from Dorset, and the distinction mattered to her, though she had stopped correcting it after the 3rd occasion because correcting it required explaining how she knew the difference which required explaining who she was, and who she was a longer conversation than the correction warranted. Her name was Ada Voss. 26 years old. The daughter of a land agent who had died 18 months ago, leaving behind 3 things of value: a comprehensive knowledge of estate management absorbed by his eldest daughter over 23 years of following him around properties that required understanding, a library of surveying and agricultural texts that she had read twice each, and a reputation for precision that had survived his death and had produced, 6 weeks ago, a letter from the Hartwell estate solicitors asking whether Miss Voss was available for a short-term engagement to assess certain management inefficiencies and provide recommendations. She had been available. She had arrived with 2 trunks. She was standing in the north field looking at the drainage problem and understanding, with the specific focused clarity she brought to all problems, exactly what had been causing it for 4 years and exactly what was required to fix it and approximately what it would cost and how quickly the investment would return in improved yields. She was not thinking about winter. She was thinking about subsurface water movement and the specific geological composition of the North Field's lower quadrant and whether the Hartwell estate had the organizational capacity to execute a drainage correction of this scale without external contractors. The answer to the last question was not yet clear. The answer to everything else was very clear. She took out her notebook and began writing. Stay with me. Because this is not the story of a woman who set out to prove a duke wrong. She never heard what he said at the Ashmore Hunt breakfast. She was standing in a field. This is the story of a woman who came to do a job and did it with complete precision, and what happened to an estate, and a man, and a prediction, when real work meets real capability. Welcome to Regent Hearts. Subscribe before we go further. Every story here reaches somewhere real. Hit the bell. Now let us begin. Her father had taken her to her first estate assessment when she was 4 years old. Not as a lesson. As a practical matter, her mother had died when Ada was 3 and her father was a man who loved his work and his daughter in approximately equal measure and had found it more efficient to bring the latter to the former than to arrange for her to be elsewhere. She had sat on fence posts and watched him walk fields. She had sat in estate offices and watched him review ledgers. She had sat beside him in the carriage between properties and listened to him explain what he was looking for and why it mattered and what the specific evidence of good management looked like versus the evidence of management that was technically present and functionally absent. By 12 she was asking questions he found it necessary to actually answer. By 16 she was identifying problems before he pointed them out. By 20 she was writing the preliminary assessments and he was reviewing and occasionally correcting them and increasingly not needing to correct them. By 23, when her father's health had begun its decline, she was conducting the assessments alone and writing the reports under his name because no estate steward in England was going to commission an assessment from a 23-year-old woman regardless of what the assessment contained. By 25, when he died, she was the most comprehensively educated land agent in 3 counties with a name that was legally her own and professionally useless and a knowledge base that had nowhere useful to go. She had spent 18 months being asked to assist with things that required her knowledge while being paid as though she were providing a service of lesser value, by men who understood that she understood more than they did and found this simultaneously useful and uncomfortable. The Hartwell letter had been different. The Hartwell letter had asked for Miss Voss specifically. Had named her specifically. Had offered terms that reflected the actual value of what was being requested. She had packed 2 trunks and come to Hartwell. She had been there for 3 weeks when she stood in the North Field. She had been there for 1 week when she had understood that the drainage problem was the smallest of the estate's difficulties. The Hartwell estate was a significant property. Approximately 4,000 acres across 5 distinct land types. A main house that had been managed well in the previous generation and less well in the current one, not from neglect exactly but from the specific management failure of a duke who understood the estate as a thing he owned rather than a thing he operated. The Duke of Hartwell was 32 years old. His name was Nicholas Ashford. He was present on the estate approximately 3 weeks in 4, the 4th week being occupied with parliamentary commitments or the London social season or the specific obligations of a man of his position that produced regular and predictable absences. During his presence on the estate he managed it in the specific way of a man who had inherited management protocols from his father and applied them without assessment of whether the protocols remained appropriate for current conditions. They did not. Ada had understood this within 4 days. She had spent the first week with Mr. Hodges, who was 61 and had been the Hartwell estate steward for 23 years and who received her with the specific careful courtesy of a man who had been promised that the woman from Somerset would provide recommendations and had decided to reserve judgment about whether the recommendations would be worth receiving. She had spent the second week reading every estate record she could access. She had spent the third week walking the property. By the end of the third week she had a complete picture of an estate that was significantly underperforming its potential due to 4 specific management failures, 2 structural maintenance deferrals, 1 persistent agricultural practice that had been producing diminishing yields for 6 years without anyone formally documenting the diminishment, and the drainage problem in the North Field. She had also met the Duke twice. The first time was in the entrance hall on her second day. He had come through from the stable yard and she had been crossing toward the library and they had occupied the same space for 30 seconds during which he had looked at her with the expression of a man encountering something in his entrance hall that he had agreed to have there and was now physically reminded of. He had said, "Miss Voss." She had said, "Your Grace." He had continued to the staircase. She had continued to the library. The second time was in the estate office on her 9th day. She had been reviewing the quarterly accounts with Mr. Hodges when the Duke appeared in the doorway with a letter he required Mr. Hodges to act on and had found his estate steward in conversation with the woman from Somerset and both of them surrounded by 4 years of quarterly accounts spread across the office floor in an organizational system that was not the one Mr. Hodges normally used. He had looked at the floor. He had looked at Ada. He had said, "Miss Voss. How are you finding the accounts?" She had said, "Incomplete in 3 specific areas." The methodology for recording improvement expenditure conflates capital investment with maintenance cost in a way that makes the true yield to investment ratio illegible. "I am correcting it." He had looked at the floor again. He had given Mr. Hodges the letter. He had left. Mr. Hodges had looked at Ada after the Duke's footsteps retreated down the corridor. He had said, "You told him the accounts were incomplete." She had said, "They are incomplete." He had said, "In 3 specific areas." She had said, "Yes." He had looked at her for a moment. Then he had bent down and picked up the next quarterly account file. October at Hartwell was the specific beautiful melancholy of a significant country estate preparing for winter. The gardens were doing what gardens did in October, burning through their last colors with the specific urgency of things that understood their time was finite. The fields were transitioning. The mornings were cold with the clean cold that came before the damp cold. Ada was in her element. She had always been in her element in October on estates. There was a particular quality to the work in October, the clarity of a landscape that had finished performing its summer self and was showing its actual structure, the visible evidence of what had been managed well and what had not, the specific honesty of bare fields and stripped hedgerows. She walked the property every morning before breakfast. She spent her days in the estate office or the library or the fields. She spent her evenings writing the assessment. The Duke ate dinner at 7. She ate at the same table because the household schedule placed her there and she had not been asked to do otherwise. They ate in the specific companionable silence of two people who had agreed to be in the same room without agreeing to perform sociability. Occasionally he asked a question. She answered it. On the 14th evening he asked, the North Field drainage. What is your assessment of the remediation cost? She had been waiting for this question. She said, the remediation requires two components. The primary intervention is a subsurface channel installed along the northern boundary of the lower quadrant, approximately 40 meters. The secondary intervention is a revised surface grading in the eastern section that is currently directing water toward the channel blockage rather than away from it. Combined cost is approximately £120. The return in improved yield over 2 seasons will exceed £400. He had been cutting his meat. He set down his knife. He said, Mr. Hodges estimated the remediation at £400. She said, Mr. Hodges estimated the cost of the solution his drainage contractor proposed in 1849. That solution addresses the symptom. I am proposing a solution that addresses the cause. The cause is the surface grading, not the subsurface blockage. Fix the grading first and the subsurface channel becomes a minor secondary measure rather than a major primary intervention. He looked at her. He said, you can demonstrate this. She said, I have a diagram in the assessment notes. I can show you tomorrow morning if you want to walk the North Field. He said, tomorrow morning. She said, 7 o'clock. He said, 7 o'clock. They finished dinner. The following morning they were in the North Field at 7 o'clock and she showed him the diagram and walked him through the surface grading issue and he stood in the cold October morning and looked at the field with the expression of a man who is seeing something he has been looking at for 4 years and has not previously seen. He said, Hodges has been managing this field for 23 years. She said, Mr. Hodges is an excellent steward. He knows this estate comprehensively. He identified the drainage problem and reported it quarterly without fail. He was not provided with an analysis that distinguished between cause and symptom because no one had conducted one. That is not a failure of Mr. Hodges. He said, of whom is it a failure? She said, of the assessment process. Specifically of the practice of managing an estate of this complexity without periodic external review. The quarterly reports go to you. You receive them. But reviewing management methodology requires the specific distance that internal reporting cannot produce. That is not a failure of yours either. It is a structural gap. He looked at her. He said, you are being careful not to assign blame. She said, I am being accurate about causation. Those are different things. He said, most consultants assign blame. It makes the recommendations easier to accept. She said, it also makes them easier to reject. I prefer recommendations that are accurate. He looked at the North Field. He said, implement the surface grading correction first. She said, I will speak to Mr. Hodges this afternoon. They walked back to the house in the cold morning. Ada walked beside him and noted, without drawing conclusions from it, that this was the longest continuous conversation they had had and that it had produced specific decisions rather than general impressions and that the Duke of Hartwell, when presented with precise information in precise language, was a man who made decisions. She filed this under useful information and continued the assessment. November changed something. Not dramatically. The estate changed in the way estates changed in November. the last color leaving the trees, the first real cold arriving, the mornings producing frost that silvered the grass and made the fields look like something between the world and a formal version of itself. Ada's assessment was substantially complete. She had identified, documented, and proposed solutions for 11 specific management improvements. 7 were implementable within the current budget. 2 required modest investment with clear return projections. 2 were longer-term structural questions requiring the Duke's strategic decision. She had given Mr. Hodges the preliminary findings 3 weeks ago. Mr. Hodges had read them with the expression of a man encountering a document that contained things he already knew and things he had not previously known and things that were so obvious in retrospect that encountering them formally produced the specific discomfort of the obvious made visible. He had said, the crop rotation analysis. She had said, yes. He had said, I knew the yields were declining. She had said, you reported the declining yields quarterly. The reports were accurate. They were not accompanied by an analysis of cause because that analysis required the soil assessment data that was not being collected. I have recommended adding soil assessment to the quarterly protocol. He had said, it is not a complicated addition. She had said, no. The complication was not knowing it was missing. Mr. Hodges had folded the document carefully. He had said, Miss Voss. She had said, yes. He had said, how long are you planning to stay? She had looked at him. She had said, I was engaged for a short-term assessment. The assessment is substantially complete. I expect to finish the formal report by the end of November. Mr. Hodges had looked at his desk. He had said, I see. The conversation had moved on. But November brought something else along with the cold and the frost and the completion of the assessment. The Duke began appearing. Not in the scheduled ways, not in the estate office for account reviews or in the north field for drainage inspections or at the dinner table at 7. In the unscheduled ways. In the library when she was working on the crop rotation analysis at 9 in the morning. In the corridor outside the estate office at 11. In the stable yard when she was walking back from the south field at 3:30. Not lingering. Not performing presence. Simply, appearing. In the specific way of a man who has found himself repeatedly in the vicinity of a place where a particular person tends to be and has not yet decided whether to acknowledge the pattern. She noticed. She did not draw conclusions. She continued the assessment. One morning in the second week of November, the Duke appeared in the library at 9 as she was cross-referencing the crop rotation data with the soil drainage records and said, the Pemberton harvest. She looked up. He said, Sir Arthur Pemberton's estate in the next county. I heard his wheat yield this year was 30% above last year's. He changed something. She said, soil amendment program combined with a 2-year rotation reset. He engaged an agricultural consultant 18 months ago. I know the report. My father conducted the preliminary assessment of the Pemberton South Fields in 1849. He looked at her. He said, your father worked for Pemberton. She said, my father worked for 43 estates in the southwestern counties over 30 years. Pemberton was one of them. He said, and you? She said, I assisted my father from the age of 12. He said, and conducted assessments under his name. She went very still. He said, I read his obituary. It mentioned his daughter who had accompanied him on assessments since childhood. It also mentioned that the quality of his work in his final years was exceptional. I hired you because the 3 assessments completed in his final 2 years, which you wrote, were the most precise land management documents I had encountered. She said, you knew. He said, I knew that the work was yours. I did not know the specific details of the arrangement. I know them now from the documents. She said, most men find that information uncomfortable. He said, most men are managing their own discomfort rather than their estates. I am attempting to manage my estate. She looked at him. He looked back. He said, is the crop rotation analysis complete? She said, the analysis is complete. The recommendation requires your decision on the 2-year reset versus the phased approach. He said, show me. She showed him. He chose the phased approach with reasoning she found sound. They worked on it for 2 hours. At 11 o'clock she said, I should mention that my formal report will be complete by the end of November. I expect to deliver it to you and Mr. Hodges in the last week of the month, and then, the engagement was short-term. He said, yes. She said, I will need to make arrangements. He said, yes. Neither of them said anything further. She went back to the crop rotation analysis. He stayed in the library for another 40 minutes, reading correspondence that he had brought with him and that he could have read in his study. Mr. Hodges found her in the north field on the 20th of November. Not to discuss the drainage. The drainage correction had been implemented 3 weeks earlier and was performing exactly as projected, and Mr. Hodges had mentioned this in the weekly estate meeting with the specific careful neutrality of a man who had managed an estate for 23 years and was finding the experience of watching his quarterly reports become correctable somewhat adjusting. He had come to the north field to say something else. He said, I want to speak plainly, Miss Voss. She said, please do. He said, when you arrived, I thought you would be gone by winter. Most of the external consultants they bring in are gone in a month. They produce recommendations and leave, and the recommendations sit on a shelf. That has been my experience. She said, yes. He said, your recommendations are not sitting on a shelf. She said, no. He said, the north field drainage is fixed. The crop rotation protocol is being revised. The maintenance schedule is restructured. The quarterly accounts are now legible in the way they were not before. We have had 4 tenant disputes resolved in the past 6 weeks using the mediation protocol you established. She said, yes. He said, I am 61 years old. I have been steward here since your Grace's father ran this estate. I know this land better than I know most things. And I need to tell you something. She waited. He said, the assessment you have produced is the most comprehensive review this estate has received in the 40 years I have been associated with it. Not just the recommendations. The understanding. You understand this estate the way my father understood the fields he grew up farming, in the specific way of someone who has looked at something until they know its nature. She said, thank you. He said, I have told His Grace. She looked at him. He said, I told him this morning. I told him that the engagement should not be short-term. She said, Mr. Hodges. He said, I know it is not my place to determine the terms of an engagement. I know you are a professional with your own decisions to make. But I have spent 23 years watching this estate underperform what it should produce, and I have submitted the same quarterly reports, and I have wanted someone to look at it the way you have looked at it for 23 years. And I am 61. I will not be here indefinitely. And there are things in this estate that I understand and that you now understand and that no one else understands, and I find I am not comfortable with the idea of the end of November. She looked at the north field. The drainage correction. The revised surface grading. The water moving correctly for the first time in 4 years. She said, I see. He said, that is all I wanted to say. He walked back toward the house. She stood in the north field for a long time. She was completing the formal report. It was a substantial document, 43 pages covering the 11 management improvements, the soil amendment program, the drainage correction, the crop rotation revision, the restructured maintenance schedule, the quarterly account methodology, the tenant dispute protocol, and 2 longer-term strategic recommendations that required the Duke's decision about the direction of the estate's development over the following decade. She worked on it in the library in the evenings after dinner. She worked on it with the specific focused attention of someone completing something they are proud of while also understanding that completion means departure. She had not arranged alternative employment. She had not thought about what came after Hartwell in the specific planning way she normally thought about things because she had been occupied with Hartwell and because thinking about what came after Hartwell required thinking about leaving Hartwell, and she had found, over the past 7 weeks, that thinking about leaving was producing an unusual resistance that she had been filing under. Requires further examination and had not yet examined. The Duke found her in the library on the 23rd of November at 10 o'clock at night. She was on the last section of the report. The strategic recommendations. The section that required the clearest thinking because it was the section that contained not what had happened but what could happen, the long view of what an estate of Hartwell's quality could produce over a decade of coherent management. He came in without knocking, which he had started doing somewhere in the middle of November, and sat in the chair across from her desk without being invited, which he had also started doing. He said, "The 23rd. She said, "Yes." He said, "You said the end of November." She said, "I will finish the report on the 27th. I can present it to you and Mr. Hodges on the 28th. He said, "And then?" She said, "And then the engagement is complete." He said, "Where will you go?" She looked up from the report. He was looking at her with the expression she had been cataloging since October, the one that arrived when she said something precise and unexpected and that she had been carefully not drawing conclusions from. She said, "I have not made specific arrangements." He said, "Because?" She said, "Because I have been occupied with the report." He said, "Mr. Hodges spoke to me." She said, "I know." He said, "He told me the engagement should not be short-term." She said, "I know what he told you." He said, "Did he tell you what I said when he told me?" She said, "No." He looked at her. He said, "I told him I had already arrived at that conclusion." The library was very quiet. The fire was low and warm. The report was 42 pages complete on the desk between them. She said, "When did you arrive at it?" He said, "The North Field. The morning you showed me the surface grading diagram." She said, "That was the 14th of October. He said, "Yes." She said, "You have known since the 14th of October that you wanted to extend the engagement." He said, "I have known since the 14th of October that I did not want you to leave." Those are related but not identical statements. She looked at him. He said, "The 14th of October I watched you walk me through a drainage problem that had cost this estate 4 years of diminished yield and demonstrate, in 20 minutes, that the cause was different from what everyone including me had understood it to be, and that the solution cost £120 rather than 400, and that the reason no one had found this was that no one had looked at the problem from a position of actual knowledge rather than familiarity." She said, "It is a straightforward surface hydrology problem." He said, "Not to everyone." She said, "To anyone who has walked enough fields with adequate attention." He said, "You walked this field with specific attention. Not general competence. Specific care for this field, this estate, this specific problem. I have had consultants before who walked fields with general competence. You walked it as though it mattered to you specifically." She said, "It did matter to me specifically. All of them do. My father told me at 12 years old that an estate is a living system and that assessing it without caring about its health produces recommendations that are technically correct and practically empty. I have never been able to separate the assessment from the care." He said, "I know. I have been watching you for 7 weeks." She said, "I know you have been watching." He said, "What did you conclude?" She said, "I did not allow myself to conclude anything. The engagement was short-term and I was here professionally, and drawing personal conclusions from professional proximity seemed inadvisable." He said, "And now?" She said, "And now it is the 23rd of November and the report is almost done and you are telling me you have known since the 14th of October that you did not want me to leave." He said, "Yes." She said, "And I have been filing the evidence in a category labeled requires further examination for 7 weeks." He said, "What did the category contain?" She said, "You in the library at 9 in the morning when you have a study. You at the dinner table asking questions that were specifically about the work rather than generally about the engagement. The Northfield Conversation. The Pemberton Harvest. The crop rotation analysis for 2 hours. You staying in the library for 40 minutes after I told you the engagement was ending. He said, 43 minutes. She looked at him. She said, you knew how long you stayed. He said, I was aware of the time, yes. She said, Nicholas. His name. The first time. He said, yes. She said, the report needs 2 more days. He said, I know. She said, and then we need to have a different conversation from this one. He said, about what comes after the engagement. She said, about what I require if I stay. Not the engagement terms. The other requirements. He said, tell me the other requirements. She said, I require to be here as what I am. Not as a consultant who can be introduced as a temporary arrangement. Not as a woman in the East Wing that will be gone by winter. As the person who understands this estate in the specific way Mr. Hodges described. His expression changed. She said, you said that at the Ashmore Hunt breakfast. She'll be gone by winter. Lord Cavendish asked about me and you told him it was a temporary arrangement. He said, yes. I said it. She said, I did not hear it when you said it. I heard it 3 weeks ago from one of the house staff who heard it from someone who was at the breakfast. I have been thinking about it since. He said, what have you been thinking? She said, that it was accurate when you said it. The engagement was short-term. I was expected to produce recommendations and leave. That was the arrangement. You described the arrangement correctly. He said, and now. She said, and now the arrangement is different if it continues. And if it continues as something that is named correctly. He said, named as. She said, permanent. Specific. Public. Not a temporary arrangement in the East Wing. The Lady of Hartwell. The person who understands this estate and manages it and is here as a person not a function. He said, and the other thing. She said, what other thing? He said, there are 2 requirements in what you have just said. One is professional. The other is personal. I would like to be specific about both. She looked at him. He said, stay. Not as the consultant. Not as the arrangement. As mine. As the person I have been watching for 7 weeks with the specific understanding that I have not encountered anyone who sees things the way you see them and that this estate and this house and everything in it is better for your presence and that she'll be gone by winter was the worst prediction I have made in my adult life and I intend it to be the last one I make about you. She said, that is a significant statement. He said, it is an accurate one. She said, you should know that I will continue to tell you when the accounts methodology is wrong. He said, I am counting on it. She said, and when the management decisions are suboptimal. He said, yes. She said, and I intend to finish the strategic recommendations section with full specificity about what this estate requires over the next decade. He said, I want to read every word of it. She said, Mr. Hodges will also need to be involved in the implementation planning. He said, Mr. Hodges will be involved in everything. She said, he has been here 23 years. He knows things I do not know yet. He said, yet. She looked at him. The fire was low. The library was warm. Outside, November was doing what November did at Hartwell, cold and clear and preparing to become December. She said, yes. He said, yes to staying or yes to both. She said, yes to both. Those were never actually separable. He stood up. He crossed to the desk. He held out his hand. She put down her pen. She took his hand. He said, the report. Finish it. She said, I will finish it on the 27th. He said, and after the 27th. She said, after the 27th we begin the implementation planning. He said, and after that. She said, after that we begin the decade. He said, I would like to begin it immediately. She said, the implementation planning is part of the decade. They are not separate stages. He said, I know. I was not talking about the implementation planning. She looked at him. He was not performing the statement. She said, neither was I. The first frost came on the 2nd of December. Ada stood at the library window in the early morning and watched it silver the Hartwell grounds, the formal gardens, the kitchen garden, the south field visible at the edge of the property, the north field where the drainage was correct for the first time in 4 years. She had been at Hartwell for 9 weeks. She was still here. Mr. Hodges was in the estate office when she arrived at 8 with the implementation planning document, the follow-on from the formal report, the specific action plan for each of the 11 recommendations with timelines and budget allocations and responsibility assignments and the monitoring protocol she had designed to ensure the quarterly reports would capture whether the changes were producing their projected outcomes. He looked at the document. He looked at her. He said, implementation planning. She said, Page 1 is the Northfield Winter Monitoring Protocol. The drainage correction needs 1 full winter cycle to confirm the subsurface hydrology behaves as projected. I have designed a monthly measurement schedule. He said, I see. She said, Page 12 is the crop rotation transition schedule. The first phase begins in March. He said, yes. She said, and page 27 is the long-term soil amendment program. This is a 5-year commitment. I want to establish the baseline measurements before December ends so we have accurate starting data. He said, Miss Voss. She said, yes. He said, the Duke spoke to me this morning. She was still. He said, he told me you would be staying. Permanently. As the Lady of Hartwell. She said, yes. He said, I am very glad to hear it. She said, I wanted to tell you myself. He said, you are telling me through the implementation planning document. She said, yes. That is how I tell things. He looked at the document. He said, page 27. 5-year soil amendment program. She said, someone who is leaving does not write a 5-year program. He said, no. They do not. She put the document on his desk. He picked it up. They began working through the implementation planning. The first frost held through the morning. By afternoon it had gone and the Hartwell estate was showing itself in the specific clear winter light that came after frost, everything sharp and defined and honest. Ada walked the north field at 3 o'clock. The drainage correction held. The water was moving correctly. She made a note in the measurement log. She wrote the date, December 2nd, and the reading and the notation that the first frost cycle was tracking correctly with the projected hydrology. She walked back to the house. Nicholas was in the entrance hall when she came in from the cold, stamping frost from her boots, her notebook in her hand, her face carrying the specific aliveness she had after field work in cold weather. He looked at her. She said, the drainage is holding through the first frost. I have the measurement logged. He said, good. She said, the January reading will be the more significant test. The freeze-thaw cycle will show whether the subsurface channel is behaving correctly. He said, I will come with you for the January reading. She said, 7 o'clock. He said, 7 o'clock. She went toward the library. He said, Ada. She stopped. He said, she'll be gone by winter. She looked at him. Something in her face, not performed. The specific expression of a person who has been told a thing and has lived the opposite of the thing and finds the irony both specific and exactly right. She said, I heard. He said, it was the worst prediction I have made. She said, it was accurate when you made it. He said, it was not accurate. It was the category I was using before I understood what I was looking at. She said, and now? He said, now I understand what I am looking at. She said, and what are you looking at? He said, the Lady of Hartwell. The person who knows this estate the way it has never been known. The person who will be here for the January reading and the March rotation and the 5-year soil program and every winter after this one. She said, yes. He said, the Lady of Hartwell was always more accurate than Gone by Winter. I simply did not have the information yet. She said, now you do. He said, now I do. Outside, December did what December did at Hartwell. The frost held in the low places. The drainage ran correctly. The estate prepared for winter. Inside, the Lady of Hartwell took off her cold weather coat and went to write up the day's measurement log. And the Duke of Hartwell followed her to the library because the library was where the work was and the work was where she was and there was nowhere else he preferred to be. The spring yield numbers came in at the end of June. Mr. Hodges presented them at the quarterly meeting with the expression of a man who has been waiting 23 years for a quarterly meeting to produce numbers like these and is finding the experience somewhat overwhelming. The North Field yield was up 19% over the previous year. The crop rotation revision had produced the projected improvement in soil performance across the South Fields. The maintenance schedule restructuring had reduced emergency repair costs by 38%. The tenant dispute mediation protocol had produced 0 unresolved disputes in the first 6 months, compared to 4 ongoing disputes this time the previous year. Nicholas read the numbers. He looked at Ada across the meeting table. She was already writing. She said, the soil amendment baseline readings are complete. Phase 1 of the 5-year program begins in July. The projections suggest we will see measurable improvement in the eastern quadrant yields by next spring if the first-year application performs as designed. Mr. Hodges said, my father farmed the eastern quadrant. He always said the soil was difficult. She said, the soil has a specific mineral deficiency that compound in poor drainage conditions. The drainage correction will help. The amendment program addresses the underlying composition. 5 years from now the quadrant should be among the most productive on the estate. Mr. Hodges said nothing for a moment. Then he said, my father would be very pleased to hear that. Ada said, I would like to document the methodology fully so that when I am eventually not doing this work, whoever does it next has the complete picture. Nicholas looked at her. She said, not in the immediate term. In the long term. All work of this kind should be documented well enough to survive its author. Mr. Hodges said, that is a very professional approach to a 20-year plan. She said, it is a practical one. Nicholas said, you are planning for 20 years. She said, the soil amendment program is 5 years. What comes after the soil amendment program is another 10. The estate's natural productive ceiling, if all the management improvements are sustained, is significantly above its current performance. Getting to that ceiling takes approximately 20 years of coherent management. Nicholas said, 20 years. She said, yes. He said, she'll be gone by winter. She looked at him across the meeting table. Mr. Hodges looked at his numbers. She said, the quarterly numbers are very good. He said, yes. They are. She said, the January drainage reading was the significant one. We should have the full frost cycle data written into the North Field management record before the October review. He said, yes. She said, I'll have it done by September. He said, I know. She went back to her notes. He watched her write. Mr. Hodges cleared his throat. He said, I believe there are also the summer tenancy renewals to discuss. She said, page 4 of the agenda. They continued the meeting. Outside, June at Hartwell was doing what June did, long and green and full of the productive hum of an estate that was, for the first time in a significant number of years, working correctly. And the Lady of Hartwell wrote up the quarterly numbers with the specific satisfied precision of someone who had projected them 9 months ago and found them accurate and was already thinking about next year.
Before you go. Nicholas Ashford said she'll be gone by winter at the Ashmore Hunt breakfast in October. She was in the North Field when he said it. She was not trying to prove him wrong. She was not trying to stay. She was standing in a field looking at a drainage problem with the specific attention of someone who cares about the health of the thing they are assessing. That attention is what made her stay. Not strategy. Not ambition. Not the decision to become the Lady of Hartwell. The decision to look at a field the way it deserved to be looked at. And an estate that had been underperforming for 4 years responded to that attention the way things respond to being genuinely seen. It showed her everything. And a duke who said she'll be gone by winter watched her walk his north field and understood, on the 14th of October, that the prediction was the worst he would ever make. He was right about that. Subscribe to Regent Hearts. Share this today. Tell me in the comments which moment reached you. The north field at 7 o'clock. The methodology that conflates capital investment with maintenance cost. Mr. Hodges and 23 years. The library on the 23rd of November. The first frost. Or the quarterly meeting in June, 20 years, and the prediction repeated one final time. I read every single one. See you in the next story.